Today's topic is the agenda, and it might seem amazing that we could spend an hour on the agenda, but it actually is a fairly involved topic. So the material we're going to cover in this class, we're going to talk about the proper sequence of an agenda as recommended by Robert's Rules of Order, and what you can do if you don't like the proposed sequence. We'll talk about what belongs in each section of the agenda. We'll talk about the consent calendar and why that is useful and how it can be abused. We'll talk about how the agenda is proposed, and then how the agenda can be modified during the meeting. So key concepts of the agenda is that the bylaws typically specify who proposes the agenda. This is often a task of the chair. In the absence of the language assigning this to in the bylaws, Robert's Rules gives the task to the secretary. Ultimately, the agenda is owned by the assembly. There are chairs that sort of miss this concept. They think that they own the agenda and that they get to decide what is and what is not on the meeting. But if it's a democratically run meeting, the agenda actually belongs to the membership, and the majority gets to decide how they're going to spend their time. If no order of business is specified in the bylaws, then the agenda should follow the order of business as prescribed in whatever parliamentary authority you use. And today we'll be talking about the order that is specified in Robert's Rules of Order. There was a question on how you handle topics like new business when that really takes up the majority of the meeting, and you want to make sure that you get to that topic. And so there are several things you can do about that, and we'll talk about that later in the meeting. But the basic concept, is the actual order of what you do is up to the majority, regardless of what is proposed at the beginning of the meeting in terms of the agenda. So you can do a number of things to either rearrange it when you first approve it, or move things to the subsequent meeting. This is the usual order of business. So the first thing, and so the determination of a quorum is not considered an agenda item. It's just something that the chair has to do in order to determine if you can have a meeting in which valid decisions are made, or if you have to postpone the meeting or do one of the other options you have when you don't have a quorum. So the usual order of business is that you first read and approve the minutes of the prior meeting. If you have several sets of minutes, you approve them in the chronological order in which they were taken. So you'd start with the oldest and then continue on and approve the minutes until you've approved all of the minutes. Then you have the reports of the officers, the boards, and the standing committees. And the order of the officers is typically the order in which their positions are listed in the bylaws. Usually you have a president, and then perhaps your vice president, and then if you might have a second vice president, and then you might have the secretary, and then you might have the treasurer, or whatever your officers are. But then you have the officers give their reports. Then if you have any boards, like an executive board, they would give their report. And then you would get reports from the standing committees if they have anything to bring before the body. And I believe we talked about this last time. Typically, work in organizations like this are done in committees, and the committees come up with recommendations and motions that they bring before the body for approval. And so this is the point in which those items are brought before the body to vote on them, on whether they agree that they should be done or not. After the standing committees are report, you then go to the report of special committees. Special committees are committees that have been set up with specific tasks, and once they complete those tasks, the special committees dissolve, and so they come next. And then the next topic is special orders, and we'll talk about specifically what this is, but these are things that are designated for the current meeting, say by the bylaws, or because someone has moved moved and made something a special order that was agreed to by a majority. And then you get to unfinished business and general orders. So unfinished business is things that might have existed on the previous meeting that you didn't get to, and the meeting adjourned before you addressed them. And so those all move into unfinished business in the current meeting. And general orders are anything else that has been moved into this meeting by someone in a previous meeting that is not a special order. So special orders get a higher priority and addressed first, and then you would do the unfinished business and general orders. And the final item then is new business, and we'll talk about what new business is when we get to that slide. So just a couple of terms. The order of business is any established sequence in which business is taken up at a session of the assembly. You can write in your bylaws an alternative order of business, and if your organization has done that, then that becomes the order of business that you follow, and it replaces what is in the parliamentary authority. So if you have a situation where you always want to do new business at the beginning, you can certainly propose that as a bylaw, and if the body agrees to it and it builds it into the bylaws, then that becomes the order of business. There's a privilege motion, call for the orders of the day, which sort of sounds like old English, but this is a privileged motion that requests that the agenda be adhered to. The great thing about this motion is that it is not debatable, and no second is required, and it's also interruptible. So people do not have to sit and endure a meeting that has gone off track for 20 minutes. Every member has the right to make a motion to adhere to the agenda. And as I said, it doesn't require a second. It doesn't require being acknowledged, and it's not debatable. So if the meeting has gone off track, you just say, Chair, I call for the orders of the day. And that requires the chair to get the meeting back on track and discuss the things that is on the agenda that had been agreed to. And then a quorum is the number of members who must be present in the order that business can be validly transacted. So you can have a meeting, and a meeting counts as a meeting if you don't have a quorum. Like if you're required to have a monthly meeting and everyone showed up and you don't have a quorum, your meeting occurred because you met the requirements of having the meeting, but you don't have a quorum, and so you cannot actually vote on things and transact business. The term general orders is any question which but usually by postponement has been made an order of the day without being a special order. So someone says, I move that we discuss having a holiday party at the beginning of December at the next meeting. So something like that, if it is passed as a resolution, then becomes a general order. If someone wants to make it a special order, then they would put that in the language of the motion. I move that we have a special order at the next meeting to discuss holiday parties throughout the year. And then that would move that item up in the agenda and get discussed before general orders. And as I said earlier, things that are required by the bylaws, such as elections or maybe a convention, those are specified in the bylaws and they have to be addressed. And so those also get a higher priority and become special orders on the agenda. Oh, there's a question, does the call for orders of the day apply to an on-topic discussion that has devolved into futility? So there is if they are talking about the topic that is on the agenda, it is their right to do so. if the discussion starts becoming redundant, then you have the ability to call the question, and we will talk about that motion and its proper usage at the next class a week from Monday. But if you sometimes get people that are really passionate about something and they just won't let go. If 2/3 of the assembly does not want to sit there listening to this, then they can vote to end debate and move on. That's their right. We have such a large group. What I'll do is just read through the script for approval of the agenda so you can see how this goes. Make it a little bigger. So if I'll just read through this and hopefully you'll be able to follow and get the concepts. So the chair is Ms. Scarlett, and the chair says the regular meeting of the Shively Park Improvements Committee will come to order. It's 7:01 and the quorum is present. Everyone should have a copy of the proposed agenda. Are there any changes or corrections to the agenda? And Colonel Mustard raises his hand. Ms. Scarlett says the chair recognizes Colonel Mustard. Colonel Mustard says at the last meeting we postponed approval of the park usage rules until this meeting. So the chair says, oh, thank you, Colonel Mustard. The chair apologizes for that oversight. Approval of the park usage rules will be made a general order under unfinished business. Are there any other changes? So this is where the chair inadvertently had missed something, and that was brought to their attention, and so it has to be on the agenda, and so they just proceed with adding it. So Mrs. Peacock raises her hand for recognition, and so the chair recognizes Mrs. Peacock, and Mrs. Peacock says, please remove the second item from the consent calendar regarding acceptance of the grant from the Good Times Marijuana Dispensary. And then the chair says, the grant from the Good Times Marijuana Dispensary is moved to new business. Are there any other changes? And this is about the consent calendar, which we will talk about later in the class. But if there's anything that's been put on the consent calendar at the request of any member, it can be pulled off the consent calendar and moved to the agenda for regular debate. Then Mrs. White raises her hand, and the chair says, the chair recognizes Mrs. White. Mrs. White says, I move that we add a special order for Colonel Mustard to give a report from his trip to Europe on the Italian, French, and English gardens he visited. The chair says, is there objection to adding a special order for Colonel Mustard to give a report from his trip to Europe on the Italian, French, and English gardens he visited? And this is an attempt to dispense with voting if the majority, if everyone is in agreement, so you don't waste time going through the votes and the vote counting. You can try unanimous consent to get something passed, and if everyone is in agreement, then it just makes the meeting go a little more efficiently. But in this case, Mr. Green says, I object. So if anyone objects to a request for unanimous consent, then you don't receive unanimous consent, and you have to default back to taking a vote on what the majority wants to do. And so the chair says, the motion is to add a special order for Colonel Mustard to give a report from his trip to Europe on the Italian, French, and English gardens he visited. Is there any discussion? And so Mr. Green says, I would like to hear about Colonel Mustard's trip, but we already have a packed agenda. I'd prefer that Colonel Mustard work with the chair to find a better time for the presentation. The chair says, is there any further discussion? So this is an amendment to the agenda. And so this is actually treated as an amendment to a motion, which is what we discussed at the last meeting. And so that's why you have the debate, and then you have a vote on this item. So the body decides if they want to add this to the agenda. So the chair says, the question is on adding special orders, a special order for Colonel Mustard to give the report from his trip to Europe on the Italian, French, and English gardens he visited. A majority vote is required to amend the agenda. All those in favor say aye. One person says aye. All those opposed say no. Everyone else says no. And so the chair says the noes have it, and the motion to add a special order for Colonel Mustard to give a report from his trip to Europe on the Italian, French, and English gardens he visited fails. And then the chair says, if there are no objections, the agenda is adopted as amended. So this is a final opportunity. The chair is sensing that everyone has had their way with the agenda, and we now have something that can be approved. And so they're asking for unanimous consent on the amended agenda. No one objects to it, and so the chair then says the agenda is adopted, and the first order of business is approval of the minutes. So that's the process for amending an agenda. There's two instances of this. If you move to amend the agenda when it's proposed, then it just requires a majority vote to change the agenda. If during the meeting someone wants to rearrange the agenda that it had been already agreed upon, then it requires a 2/3 vote to change the course of the agenda. So hopefully that's clear. So the first agenda item is the reading and approval of the minutes. A formal motion to approve the minutes is not necessary, but it is also not out of order. And so this is another place in which, an abbreviated approach to the rules of order can be invoked to just move things along more quickly if you're dealing on things about which no one has an emotional vested interest. So the chair can say, are there any corrections to the minutes? So, either the minutes have been distributed in advance and you can dispense with the reading of the minutes, or you've distributed the minutes during the meeting. People have to have time to read them. And so if someone wants the minutes read, you have to do that at the request of one person. But if there's no objection, then you don't have to read through the minutes. So if anyone spots something that is incorrect from the minutes, you can usually hand them by unanimous consent. And so someone says, oh, the item under the expenditures for the party is incorrect. We approved $2,500, not $1,500. And so the chair would say, is there any objection to changing the value from 2,500 to 1,500? You can't go back and incorrectly change history, so it has to be a factual change that you're amending the minutes. But usually you can handle this by unanimous consent. And if people then misremember the amount, like in this instance, then you have to handle it as you would any motion and take a vote on what people remember from the last meeting, because maybe one person thought it was $1,500 when in fact it really was $2,500. And so you have, if there's disagreement, then you have to take a vote and get the majority to agree upon what the minutes are going to state. If there were no corrections to the minutes, and 9 times out of 10, there's not. The secretary does a great job of the minutes and no one has anything to say about them. The chair can say, there being no corrections to the minutes stand as approved, or as read, or as corrected if there were some changes made to the minutes. And so that's the easy way of handling the minutes. Then the next agenda item is the report of the officers. And this includes the report of the chair or the president or whoever the presiding officer of your organization is. Then there would be any correspondence from the secretary, if the secretary is the next listed officer in the bylaws. You typically have a treasurer's report, and then you have the reports of the chairs of the standing committees. If the committees don't have anything to report, you don't even have to mention them. You don't have to spend time talking about something that's not going to happen, just to make the meeting more expeditious. So there's a distinction between officers making recommendations and committees making recommendations. If an officer makes a recommendation, say the second vice chair is in charge of membership recruitment, and the chair and the second vice chair has something that they would like to do, they should not themselves move the implementation. So it's typically, it really needs to come from the floor. So if the chair wants, so if the second vice chair wants $2,000 to publish a pamphlet to increase membership, then who's ever presiding would say the chair will entertain a motion to spend $2,000 on a pamphlet for increasing membership. So that the motion does not come from an officer, it actually comes from a member on the floor. Committees, however, are different because committees are typically made up of 2 or more people who have been doing things on the side. And so not only is there a built-in mechanism for getting a second, the committee reports are done by members, and so the chair giving the presentation for the committee can move things from the floor for adoption by the assembly. So the events chair gives a report, and then the events chair says, and so the committee moves that we spend $5,000 on a dinner acknowledging all of the people that have done volunteer contributions this year. So committee chairs can make motions when they are giving the report, and then those are either voted, those are handled then by the assembly. Unfinished business and general orders. So this is a little complicated. There's 4 categories of unfinished business. So the first one is the question that was pending when the previous meeting adjourned. So to adjourn a meeting is an incidental motion which anyone can make, and it can be during the debate of a topic. So maybe someone feels that something should be dealt with at a later date, and they just want to end the meeting because tempers are getting high, and or whatever reason they want to, they can move to adjourn the meeting. And if they do that, the question that was pending when the previous meeting adjourned then becomes unfinished but for the subsequent meeting. And then any questions that were unfinished business of the previous meeting that wasn't reached. So say you have an adjournment of 9 o'clock and you still had 3 items under unfinished business that hadn't been reached, and no one moves to extend the time of the meeting, then those items move from the current agenda onto the agenda of the subsequent meeting as unfinished business. And then there are any questions which were set as general orders from the previous meeting but wasn't reached. So, there was the unfinished business, and then there were the general orders, and then matters that were postponed or made general orders for the present meeting. So maybe at the prior meeting, someone postponed consideration of the holiday party to the current meeting, and that wasn't reached in the current meeting. So of course that then goes to the subsequent meeting. You never lose motions that were put on the, you never lose items that are put on the agenda. They have to be dispositioned in some way or another. They're either passed, or they're defeated, or they're referred to a committee, or they've been moved to a later date, but they have to be disposed of in some way so that they go away with the agreement of the assembly. They just don't disappear forever. And as you saw in the script, there was something that was put on that was supposed to be on the current agenda, and it was as soon as the chair was reminded that that was there, then that was put on the agenda. The topic of new business is an area where people may not know that they have the power to do this. So members can introduce new items for business and can move to take from the table any matter that is on the table. So if you remember from the last, I believe at the last meeting, we talked about your 4 basic rights as a member of an organization. You have the right to attend meetings, you have the right to make motions, you have the right to debate, and you have the right to vote. And so this is one of your rights to make motions under new business. So you can bring up something under new business and step up, be recognized by the chair, and present your motion for consideration by the body. So it's usually not a good idea to hit the membership with something that they're completely unfamiliar with. So hopefully you've done work in advance so people are not surprised by what you're doing. But whatever your strategy that you want to employ, you can. But it is your right to bring up anything that is within the scope of the organization up under new business. And then the last note is especially important. The chair cannot prevent the making of legitimate motions or deprive members of the right to introduce legitimate business. The whole concept of democracy is really hard for some chairs to accommodate. In a democratic society, it's not a top-down structure where you have a CEO running things. It's a bottoms-up where the decisions are made by the body themselves. And so that's why the chair should remain impartial, whether they think something is a good idea or not, and handle the business on the floor and let the majority decide how to proceed. What does it mean to take from the table any matter that's on the table? At the next class, we'll be talking about all of the incidental motions, and one of them is to lay something on the table. That has a very specific meaning inside of Robert's Rules of Order. But if you have an agenda item, like you're discussing an event for the July 4th holiday on the agenda, and then you have the governor coming in to speak to the organization, and the governor shows up early, someone could move to table the discussion on the holiday party. And what that does is put on the table that removes from the agenda that topic and sets it aside until a later point in time. And this comes from the table you see in Parliament in the UK. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the House of Commons where they have the big long table, and it physically means to take a motion that's written on paper and put it on the table, which means set it aside. And then to pull from the table is how you take something that has been put on the table back into the meeting for discussion.
Larry?
Yeah.
We had a question concerning the new business. Should new business be handled last on an? I'm sorry. That the statement was that new business should be handled last on an agenda, and that it should not take the place of the original agenda and should be handled at a later date. Some of our committees find that new business often takes over the meeting, and the older business is pushed to a later date.
So the default sequence of orders is what comes with Robert's Rules of Order, and so you either follow the default that has been given in the parliamentary authority, or you bake into your bylaws a different sequence. And so if it's more important for your organization to discuss new business, perhaps then you want to have an article in your bylaws that rearranges the order in which topics are discussed. And it's up to whatever the voting requirement in your organization is for modifying the bylaws to do that. So if it's a 2/3 vote, then by 2/3 you can have your own sequence of the agenda. And I've seen bylaws where they have their own order of business, which they follow, which is completely up to the organization to decide. The logic behind what Robert's Rules proposes is that you've got all of the important stuff from the committees who have been doing work and from the officers, and then you have your special orders that are mandated to be done during this meeting. And so new business is anything that doesn't fit in one of those other categories. And I would guess that sometimes these things that are called new business actually fit into one of the earlier categories. And so they wouldn't fall in last. New business is anything that a member wants to bring up that does not fit into any of the preceding agenda items on the agenda. So again, it's just up to what works best for your organization, the order in which you take up the agenda items. And as the script demonstrated, if you want to rearrange it, someone can move that new business for this current meeting be moved after reports of the committee. And if a majority agrees to it during the approval of the agenda, then that's when the sequence of things on the agenda can be rearranged. Did I answer that, or did I leave anything open?
I think we're okay for now. Thank you.
Okay, cool. There are also other things that you see commonly done in meetings, and these are a number of the optional headings that could occur. So sometimes you have opening ceremonies like the flag salute, or you might have a more elaborate presentation of the colors. You might have a roll call vote that's mandated in your bylaws, where you do a roll call vote to make sure that people are in the meeting. You could have a consent calendar, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. You can also have good of the order, which has a very specific meaning inside of Robert's Rules of Order. It's about things related to improving the organization, not just everything in the kitchen sink, which is sometimes what this one is used for. And then there's the eternal announcements, which you as chair have to really watch, because people often try to make political statements in the form of an announcement, which is not what that is. Announcement is like, there's going to be a picnic on Friday. And then another optional heading is a program, which is a great thing to have in meetings, because you can use it as educational or for whatever, and you could attract new people to come. Sometimes, I've been in organizations where we would do a program before the formal meeting starts. And then if you have visitors who want to hang on and see if they want to actually participate in your organization, then they can do so, but they don't have to sit through your business to wait for the program to show up. If you do have a program, that ordinarily would be after new business, because it has nothing to do with the business of the organization. Unless you separate out the program from the meeting itself, and then you can like have the program at 6:30 and then the meeting starts at 7. So a consent calendar is something that you find in governmental bodies like county commissions, and it's a useful tool for disposing of routine or non-controversial items. And if objected to, items on the consent calendar are removed and join the regular agenda items. I was a parliamentarian for an organization that for the county in which I lived in, and the staff of the county typically like to put all kinds of things on the consent calendar. And the problem with the consent calendar is that there is just one vote taken on all of the items on the consent calendar. And if everything on the consent calendar is truly in the category of non-controversial and routine, then it's perfectly fine. And sometimes, you often see things like approval of the minutes on the consent calendar, and that's just an easy way of dispensing the routine stuff so that your members can focus on more things. And typically governmental bodies have lots of things to discuss in their meetings, and so it's a benefit to them to save time wherever they can. As I said, anything earlier, anything on the consent calendar can be pulled off by any one member. So if one commissioner wants to pull off the expenditure of $250,000 for such and such, then that moves to the regular agenda, and then it comes up and is handled as any item would. But anything on the consent calendar is voted on en masse, and if it's approved, then it's done, and you don't have to spend any extra time on it. Again, I was really uncomfortable when I would see large sums of money in contracts given to contractors buried on the consent calendar, because that doesn't feel routine, and it might not necessarily be uncontroversial, especially when it comes to money. So unfortunately, in situations like a county commissioner meeting, the members are the commissioners themselves, and it's not in the public. And so if you're sitting there, you have an opportunity to speak from the public, you can say, I'm seeing on the consent calendar that you've got $250,000 going to the doggy daycare center that's owned by the mayor, and I really believe that should be pulled off and moved to the regular agenda item, so we can hear this item debated, because you want to see the members vote on it and how they're doing their business. But as a member of the public, you're not a member of the group, and so you can just suggest it. You don't have the right to remove it itself. Setting times on the agenda. So when an assigned time for taking up a topic arrives, the chair announces that fact. You got to be very careful about putting times on agendas, because if you do that, then and the agenda is passed, then the chair is required to adhere to those times that have been agreed upon. I've seen agendas where people assign times to every agenda item, which would become a nightmare to administer. But if that's what's happened, that's certainly a good way of forcing a meeting to move forward, unless someone moves to extend the time on an agenda topic and add more time to a point under discussion. But if you do have, you might want to do specific items, like have the election at 8 o'clock. So when you arrived at 8 o'clock, then you put to a vote any pending questions without allowing further debate, unless they do something like put it on the table or refer it to a committee, or a motion is made to extend time for considering the pending question. So say you're having this big, long discussion about spending money on something or other, and you have this, and it's 8 o'clock. When you reach 8 o'clock, the chair then has to end debate or allow one of these other options to happen, to either extend time or refer it to committee or whatever, however they want to handle it. But again, it's up to the majority on how they want to handle this stuff. But having times on an agenda is a really good way, especially like the time to adjourn. So one of the complaints about meetings is that meetings run too long and they're boring, and they don't stay on topic. Well, you can at least address the duration of the meeting by having a set time for adjournment, and then when you reach that, it's then a question for the assembly: do they want to extend the time of the meeting and continue to meet, or do they want to adjourn and then handle the remaining agenda items as we discussed earlier in the meeting? So in adjournment of 9 o'clock, the chair would say, it is now 9 o'clock. Is there a motion to extend the time for the meeting, or shall we adjourn? Hearing no motion to extend the meeting is adjourned. So it's as simple as that. But again, you don't have to sit there for a 4-hour meeting if it's only scheduled for 2 hours, and the membership is sitting there being held hostage. When the chair announces the hour, any member can move to reschedule the time for a recess or adjournment, or extend the time for consideration of the pending question for a specified period. The motions are undebatable and require a 2/3 vote. So it's a 2/3 vote because you are amending something that's previously adopted. And what's great about this is it's undebatable. So you don't get into a bunch of debate over and spend time over something that you really just want to move on. So if you have a human-friendly agenda and you have a long meeting, hopefully they built in a recess like midway, so that there's, people have a time to step up and stretch their legs before continuing. But if there is none, someone can move for a recess. So that's an incidental motion that we'll be discussing in the next meeting. Or if there's a recess is scheduled and you want to finish the current debate, someone can move that the recess be postponed by 10 minutes to complete debate on the current topic. And if 2/3 agree, then that's what the body does. In the case of a recess, any pending business is interrupted for the recess and taken up again after the recess. So you have a motion on the floor, people have been debating, it's time for the recess. No one has moved to change the time of the recess. So the chair says, it is now 8 o'clock or whatever the time is. We'll now have a 15-minute recess and we will resume where we left off when we reconvene. And so then when you reconvene, the chair says, we'll now continue the debate on the motion to do blah, 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 blah. And then you continue just as if the recess had not happened. So if someone wants to rearrange the agenda after it has been agreed to at the beginning of the meeting, you have some options. After obtaining the floor, a member can say, I ask unanimous consent to introduce at this time a resolution on such and such. So this is their right to make motions, but you have to have at least 2/3 agree to do that. And so what this person is asking is unanimous consent, which exceeds the threshold of 2/3. Maybe it's something that everyone's very passionate about, and it came up at the last moment, and so yes, everyone, no one objects, and then you can proceed to do this. If there is an objection, or the member anticipates that there may be, then they say, I move to suspend the rules that interfere with the introduction at this time of such and such. And the motion to suspend the rules also is something that we'll discuss at the next meeting. That's a motion which anyone can make. But the rule that this is referring to is the rule that you follow the order of the agenda. And so they're saying, I move that we take things out of order and introduce something that is of urgent nature and needs to be considered immediately. So that's the main topics on the agenda. Is there any other questions on the agenda? And then after we finish talking about the agenda, then we can go to other questions that have come up more recently about parliamentary law. So any questions on agendas?
Larry, while people are thinking of their questions, we did have a question earlier in the chat box pertaining to Robert's Rules of Order and the section on small committees. The person has the abridged version, and she said that there is no section on small committees. Would that information be found in the unabridged version?
Yes, it's a chapter called Small Boards and Committees. And this is one of those areas that personally gives me kind of angst, because it allows for an abbreviated set of rules to be followed in committees, but committees tend to be more informal, and so there's a little bit more lax process to it. It is in the full set of Robert's Rules of Order. And it talks about small boards who can also follow this. And a small board is defined as a board that is roughly 12 or less. If you have a larger board, then they really need to follow the full book of rules and how the proceedings are handled.
Great, thank you. So we do have a question. To request the floor, is it best practice to raise hands and be recognized by the chair physically in person or virtually on Zoom calls?
Yeah, you do have to do something to be acknowledged. Well, there's two instances. There are interrupting motions, and then there's motions where you need to be recognized. So if it's an interrupting motion, like a point of order, and it's urgent, then you do not have to be recognized in order to make that motion. Otherwise, if you need to be recognized, you probably have some custom in your organization, like raising your hand or standing if it's a large room, so you can visibly be seen by the chair. But the chair is the chair's responsibility to make sure that the debate and the handling of discussion on the floor is done equitably, and make their best effort to recognize anyone who wants to speak. When you get into electronic meetings, it becomes more problematic because there's great tools in Zoom for muting people and preventing them from making interrupting motions that is their right to do so. And so Robert's rules in the latest edition goes to great length explaining and suggesting things to be put into rules that you agree upon for electronic meetings, because they're, by their very nature, you are giving up your rights of participation. The fundamental idea of democratic meetings is that you're in one room, you can see each other, you can hear each other in debate, you're exchanging information, and then you vote on something based on the knowledge that you have. When you start getting into an electronic meeting environment, you can find yourself muted and unable to speak and make interrupting motions. Chairs that do this at a risk, because if the abridgment of parliamentary procedures is too great, then you could call the entire proceedings of the meeting as being a breach of parliamentary authority, and that the decisions are not valid.
And we have another question on Robert's rules. Does it have an opinion about co-chairs or co-presidents in boards or committees?
Completely silent on that one. So, what it does say is that, you configure your organization to whatever best suits the purposes of the mission of your organization. And so if you want to have co-chairs, then that needs to be written into the bylaws, and how the co-chairs are elected, and if there's any kind of specifications for the co-chairs, like someone has to be from the north part of the county and someone has to be from the south part of the county. All that should be specified in the bylaws so that the rules governing that is very clear. But you can configure your organization in any way that you see fit. You being the majority required to pass a bylaw.
Okay, thank you. And I'll read a few questions that we had received previously. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. If your question is complex, just let us know, and then you can unmute yourself to ask the question. So a few questions pertaining to minutes. If someone is not present at the meeting, does the person need to abstain when the minutes are approved?
No, if you missed a meeting, and if the next meeting, the minutes of that meeting come up, you have the right to vote on it. You might not feel comfortable doing it, and it's your right to abstain if you want to abstain, but there is no rule in the parliamentary authority that says that you have to not vote just because you weren't at the meeting.
Okay. And this was also a previous question. Can the standing committee chair make a motion to accept their own standing committee report? For example, the treasurer moving the treasurer's report. I believe you had mentioned that that's a statement of fact and does not need to be moved during the meeting. But can the chair of a standing committee make a motion to accept their own committee's report?
I don't recall any language that governs that. I mean, by giving a report, you are reporting out from the committee, and so there's a statement of fact of what happened in the committee, and then there are motions that result from the committee's work, and so someone could move to reject a committee's report, maybe if it was a complete act of fiction or something like that. But there's nothing that I can recall in Robert's Rules of Order that talks about the accepting of a report from a committee. The motions are where actions are actually taken, and that's really where the body needs to make their focus, because it has to do with business brought before the meeting, and that's where they get to vote on stuff.
Okay, thank you. How long should minutes be kept?
Minutes should be kept forever, because you can have things like rules created from motions and meetings, and if someone had not done a good job of transferring motion rules to the list of rules, like standing rules or special rules, then the only record you have of the body passing those kinds of things are in the minutes. And I've heard stories of parliamentarians going back 10 years to review prior meeting minutes to extract like all of the special rules and standing rules that have been passed, so they could get to the actual governing rules of the body. So Robert's Rules itself is silent on how long you should retain minutes, but you really should keep them forever.
Okay. And other than as soon as possible, how quickly should minutes be distributed and posted? Is there a general a standard or acceptance?
So what Roberts recommends is that, there's pros and cons about it. If you distribute, so there's two states of minutes. There's the draft version, and then there's the approved version. And until they've been approved by the body, they are a draft. It is always helpful to distribute minutes in advance, because then people can read through them. And if they find something incorrect, then they can be thoughtful about how it needs to be corrected and that sort of thing. I find it very irritating to be handed 10 pages of minutes at the beginning of the meeting and then asked to vote to approve them. And if someone did that to me, I would say, I move that consideration of these minutes be postponed to the next meeting, so we have enough time to read through them and make sure they're accurate. If they're distributed in advance, the 12th edition of Robert's Rules says that they need to be marked draft, which is a great way to use a watermark. So everyone understands that these are the proposed minutes, not the final minutes. Then after they are approved in the meeting, then you change the draft to approved, so everyone knows that these are the final version. The great thing about minutes is that you can always go back and change them. So even though your minutes are 10 years old, the body has a right to go back and correct something that was incorrectly recorded 10 years ago by a motion to revise something previously adopted.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question, I'm sorry, just going back to the specific section of Robert's Rules that state that you don't have to be at a meeting and you don't have to be at the meeting in order to vote on it. Do you have that section handy?
I'm not understanding the question completely.
Sorry. What section of Robert's Rules does it state that you don't need to be at a meeting in order to vote on it?
Is this the approval of the minutes?
Yes.
So, this sort of sounds like they're asking about proxies. So, you do have to be in a meeting in order to vote, and I can look up the section and send it to Darlene later. But the Robert's Rules does talk about proxies, and General Roberts did not think that proxies were a good idea because it kind of violates the concept of one person, one vote, because you're handing your vote over to someone else to cast it for you. Although this is commonly done. If you do have proxy voting in an organization, it has to be clearly stated how that process works in the bylaws, like how proxies are handled, who gets them, how many proxy votes someone could have. All those sort of things need to be clearly outlined in the bylaws themselves. I think that addresses the nature of the question.
Okay, and then I see a follow-up comment. It's when you weren't at the previous meeting. And I think you said you have the right to approve them, or you can abstain.
Yeah, just because you were not at the meeting for which the minutes were presented doesn't mean that you have to abstain. You can abstain, but you have the right to vote on the approval of the minutes. Okay,
and then there's also a follow-up question that one of the boards doesn't have a quorum, and they need the person that's not attending the meeting to vote on the meeting, to vote on the minutes.
If you don't have a quorum, there's a subset of activities which are allowed in the meeting. You can't make any decisions, so votes in general are not can't be validly conducted if you don't have a quorum. The things that you can do is that you can recess the meeting and go around and try to find people to attend, so a quorum is attained. You can move to have the meeting reconvene at a later date, so you have more time to make sure that you have attained a quorum for when you reconvene, or you can just adjourn. And I was at a meeting last night that didn't have a quorum, and so the meeting adjourned. So the requirement that the meeting was conducted was met, but we couldn't transact any business because a quorum wasn't attained, and there was nothing of important nature to reconvene the meeting, and so we just let the meeting end.
Okay. So there was a question about the standing rules of boards. Do they only apply to the current board, or can they apply to future boards?
So when you pass a rule, the rule exists as a rule, unless you have special language in your bylaws that say that you make up rules every time you elect a new board, which is not a typical custom. But there's three piles of rules. There's your bylaws, and then there's your special rules, which are rules that affect members' rights, and then there are standing rules, and the standing rules are really great because they outline procedures and can be passed with just a majority. Special rules have to require a 2/3 vote because they had to do with members' rights, and so you need a 2/3 vote in order to pass them. And then, of course, bylaws has a higher threshold, but anytime you change any of those rules go into effect immediately and are enduring until they've been modified at some point in the future, or there's been a proviso put in place on either when they take effect or when they sunset.
Okay. And a related question, is it possible to get phone votes from members who cannot attend the meeting?
Yes, if you have rules governing how that's done. The pandemic has put us into this whole virtual world, which makes meetings very challenging. It's great because if you have a large geographic area in which people have to meet, and if you have an in-person meeting, someone has to spend like 5 hours in a car to get there. It's great to be able to replace that with virtual meetings, but you have to have rules that govern that, and especially if you have a hybrid meeting where part of the membership is attending physically in person and part of the membership is attending virtually, you need rules in place to protect the rights of those on the line, because they tend to be forgotten and ignored. But they have the same rights as anyone attending the meeting to speak and debate and make motions and do all that stuff. So it's really important to have rules developed that make sure that everyone's rights are protected when you go into those kinds of meetings.
Okay, thank you. And could you go over what items can go into the consent calendar?
Well, the guidance is anything of routine nature and is uncontroversial. And so that is where you find broad interpretation. Like I was saying, we had a county staff that thought that $250,000 contracts were routine. And I can kind of buy into their argument, but it still, as a citizen, gives me great angst to see those sums of money sort of glossed over. And only because I had personal experience with a $500,000 grant being that was inappropriate being passed on a consent calendar. And so we had no accountability for who really voted on it because it was buried in with a bunch of other stuff. So ideally, consent calendars are things that are uncontroversial and routine, like making Tuesday, second Tuesday of the month, red licorice day or that sort of thing. Things that you don't want that are going to be passed in all likelihood, and and where your time could better spent be doing other things. So those are the kinds of things you can put on a consent calendar.
Okay, thank you. And just a follow-up question. Is it possible to vote by email?
It's possible to vote by email if you have rules governing that. In the absence of rules, then you can't do those sorts of things. And unless you've given power to make those kinds of decisions to a body, no one can make rules governing them other than the body itself. So this is where the rights of the membership is protected, and you have to really watch out for this because, even with the best intentions, you find groups thinking that they can create rules and impose them on the body and not have them voted on by the body themselves. But the body has to agree to rules that they are expected to abide by.
Okay, thank you. And we have just a few more questions about meeting, I guess, pre-meeting preparation. How far in advance does notice of a meeting need to be given?
It varies by organization. And so what Robert's rule says is that, proper prior notice needs to be given, and that's given to the organization to interpret. Hopefully your bylaws state specifically when prior notice has to be given for meetings. I've seen prior notice to be 60 days, which seems to be really, in this day and age, a 60-day notice, who knows what's going to happen in 60 days. A more reasonable time period is like 2 weeks or maybe a week, but really it's up to your organization to have, for 2/3 of your organization to vote on that rule and put it into the bylaws so that everyone understands what the expectation is.
Okay. And do slates need to be published in local newspapers?
There's no requirements in the parliamentary authority for that sort of thing. Those kinds of things are typically mandated by state or county law, where the public has an interest in what's going on. But certainly private organizations don't have to do that sort of thing unless there's a rule in the bylaws that requires them to do that.
Okay. And can you tell us when does Oprah apply?
And what is Oprah?
Oh, Open Public Records Act.
Depends on what your state has in terms of state law. So if you have open meetings laws, your state has its own implementation of those, and those are what has to be adhered to. And then the priority of laws, the state and federal laws take priority over anything you have in your bylaws. So you can't have things in your bylaws that conflict with your governing state or federal laws.
Okay, thank you. And if anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat box. And while you're doing that, Larry, I'm just going to ask if you have any other best practices for meeting minutes that you'd like to share.
The main thing about minutes is that you record what is done, not what is said. So if you think about what you want to use meetings for, you want to see what was decided at the prior meetings. And so the motions that were passed need to be in the minutes in the exact language that the motions have been made. It's improper for the recording secretary to rephrase or paraphrase motions. The motions themselves have to be in the minutes. And then unless you have a requirement that the debate is recorded, like in the county where I was parliamentarian, the county actually required that the recording secretary record, the summary of the discussion that occurred on each of the topics by the commissioners. Ordinarily, you never record what people say about things or their intent or comments that they made. You just record the actions that were done, because that's really the value of minutes, is to understand what the body decided.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so if there are, please type quickly. So just to save time, I would like to say thank you to Larry Taylor, our parliamentarian, for another great session. Our next class in this series is next Monday, the 14th, and it will focus on special motions. I'd like to thank our directors, trustees, friends, committee chairs, our colleagues from Maine and PALS Plus, and other library supporters for attending. CE certificates for professional development will be sent to our trustees at the conclusion of the series, and we'll be sending an evaluation form to all attendees after today's session. All of your feedback is important to us, so please respond, as it helps us to plan future events. I do not see any other questions in the chat box, so we'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
And just so you know, when business is included, the chair gets to adjourn the meeting. You don't even need a motion to do that.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
meeting adjourned.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.